The 75th anniversary of NATO has been having a summit here in Washington, D.C. Since a couple of days ago, and it's going to be wrapping up today. There's going to be a big press conference later this afternoon, which, by the way, we'll be giving you some a rapid response to. I'll just throw that in there right now by President Biden at the end of it. But what we've seen so far is some confusing things, a lot of self-congratulations, a lot of hand clapping and back slapping, and trying to talk about how relevant and unified NATO is and all this kind of stuff. And yesterday, trying to put a punctuation mark on it, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, which we'll show here later, released that F-16s are going to be coming, flying in the skies over Ukraine this summer. We're going to unpack a little bit about what that means with an excellent guest that we've had on a number of times now, Colonel Jacques Baud from Switzerland, former NATO officer himself. But Colonel, welcome to the show. I always love to have you on. But before we get into the F-16s and some of the practical things that have been coming out of this summit, I'd like your assessment just kind of where you think the summit has gone so far. Has it answered some of these questions about unity, and does it show itself more powerful? Is it more of a deterrent to Russia? How do you see it so far?
First of all, thank you for inviting me again to your show. My feeling is that what we have seen in Washington, D.C. those 2 days were in fact just kind of a show to hide the fact that the alliance has never been more divided than today. In fact, what we see is that, especially as regard the conflict in Ukraine, many countries do not agree with the idea of prolonging this war and supporting Ukraine into a war that has absolutely no victory in sight. So this is an aimless type of war that can only lead to the destruction of Ukraine. And I think a lot of people start to realize that, notably Viktor Orban and Mr. Fico, and probably others, but they don't dare to say it. I'm talking about the old Europe and not the new Europe. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is related to the first one, is that what we have seen in the last couple of months with the signature of all those bilateral treaties between Ukraine and individual countries such as France, Poland, Romania, and so on and so forth, it just indicates that the alliance is no longer the solution to the actual security problems of Europe. And that's the reason why we have, or the Europeans had to complement the alliance with bilateral treaties. And in fact, Ukraine is counting on those bilateral treaties. We have, that was a matter of discussion during those days in Washington, D.C., the question of the Polish support to Ukraine to protect the airspace and so on. But that indicates the whole problem, that you have in fact bilateral agreement and no involvement of the alliance. So that means that the alliance is no longer suited for the type of problem it has. And if you remember, that's not a new problem, because that came up in the early 2000s as the discussion was to intervene or not in Afghanistan. And that showed already at this stage that the alliance was not suited. I mean, the NATO was created to provide a nuclear umbrella to the European countries in case of an attack from the Warsaw Pact. I mean, the Warsaw Pact didn't exist in 1949, but that's a Soviet attack against the West. But that's the purpose. And that's also, by the way, what Jens Stoltenberg has repeatedly said, that NATO is a nuclear alliance. The problem of the nuclear alliance is that it's not well suited to deal with conflicts that are well under the nuclear level. So we have, as we have now in Ukraine, but as we had in the Balkans as well, NATO is not the real tool. I mean, in the Balkan War, NATO could provide to some extent some element of coordination, but in Ukraine, it's not really a conflict where NATO is directly involved, not in terms of command structures, coordination, and all that. And that shows the limits of such an island. And now the interesting thing is that we the and if you read the communique that was published on the NATO website,
Yeah.
it shows that NATO now is interested in participating in the conflict in China. I mean, in the Far East. So we see that a total discrepancy between what NATO was and has and is supposed to be, and the problems that the West is facing, both within Europe but also in other parts of the world.
Yeah,
So,
Colonel, I want to ask you a question. 2 days ago, when President Biden made the opening speech, kind of opened the conference up, he said something which I found a little puzzling at the time, but I'd like your view on as well. He said that he was listing out a lot of the things that what the response had been to Russia's attack into Ukraine over the years. And he said, in response, the United States has sent 100,000 now have 100,000 troops in Europe. We have sent more of these brigades, and he mentioned all these countries where they'd gone into to strengthen up the left flank of NATO, and that is how we have helped Ukraine. But when I was listening to that, I'm thinking, hang on, we're not at war with Russia. Russia has no posed conventional threat to NATO at all. It doesn't even have the capacity to do it. So what do all these new brigades and everything else, 100,000, which is frankly not that many if you're going to actually fight Russia, I don't know how that helps Ukraine at all.
my feeling, because the US started to advertise its presence in Europe early this year, as you had those rumors that Russia could continue its offensive through Ukraine and through Poland and all that. I think my feeling is that the US started to be concerned at the reaction of the Europeans, because, and you remember that in February you had Emmanuel Macron coming with his suggestion of sending troops in Ukraine. You had some declaration from the British foreign minister to say that Ukraine can use British weapons in the depth of the Russian territory. So I think that at this stage, the US and probably the Pentagon started to be a little bit alarmed by the reaction of the European countries that seemed to run wild to some extent. And this was that's how I interpreted it, by the way. But my view is that the US started to make a move towards Europe in order to reassure the Europeans, and to avoid kind of wild reaction from some member of the alliance. And also at this stage, there were a very firm reaction from Jens Stoltenberg, who said, "Well, whatever you do, the NATO will not send troops in Ukraine." And I think from a NATO side and from Stoltenberg's side, despite all the bellicose rhetoric he has, but on that point, he remained firm that NATO will not send troops in Ukraine. And I think that's the idea of the US. The US doesn't want to be involved in a larger war, doesn't want to be involved in a war that has no end for everybody. I mean, we know that the West tries to keep Russia in a permanent war, but that's more for domestic. To reach domestic objectives in Russia itself, rather than for the purpose of being at war. And and the West doesn't want to be involved in that conflict. I mean, for no country it will be a good solution. I mean, certainly not for the US in the presidential election year, but certainly not for other countries who are not in a position to have or to wage a war against Russia, like Germany, UK, and even France, by the way.
But so
They're not
let's
ready
look
for
at
that.
that, because it seems like that there is a shift in that. Number one is, as I think we have talked on several times you've been on, obviously the U.S. has given ATACMS missiles, other things that were originally redline HIMARS tanks, Patriot air defense systems, et cetera, many of which, I think if we're being honest, aren't run by Ukraine people alone. They get help from the West. So there is some of that. A couple of months back, Joe Biden gave permission to use American weapons to launch into Ukraine. Now then, I think yesterday or day before, you have Keir Starmer, the new prime minister of the United Kingdom, says, yeah, you can use our Storm missile Shadows anywhere in Russia. Poland has said, we need to be getting ready for possibly World War III, maybe within 3 to 5 years, et cetera. So it seems like people are moving more and more in that direction. And now then, as part of the summit, we are finally going to be introducing what was the last thing on the list from the very beginning, F-16s. Here is actually how Antony Blinken, Secretary of State for the U.S., put it yesterday.
As we speak, the transfer of F-16 jets is underway, coming from Denmark, coming from the Netherlands. And those jets will be flying in the skies of Ukraine this summer to make sure that Ukraine can continue to effectively defend itself against the Russian aggression.
Okay. Now we're gonna look into some of the military aspects, which is why I wanted specifically to have you on for this show about whether they can, quote, continue to defend themselves effectively against Russia. We'll see what the F-16 can do. But first of all, I think it's important to look politically and diplomatically what impacts these F-16s may unintentionally have. And for that, we need to look and see what Vladimir Putin said one of the first times people were seriously talking about bringing the F-16s in. This is what he said last year.
Their tanks are burning. Several tanks have been destroyed, including Leopards. And the F-16s will also burn. I have no doubt. If the jets are stationed at air bases outside Ukraine and used in combat operations, we will have a look at how and where we can hit the hardware being used against us.
So he's making the case that he may actually fire outside of Ukraine if F-16s launch from any airfields outside of Ukraine, or if the ones from inside. And that could be a potential escalation, which many have condemned Putin for saying, that's Article 5 if you attack into a NATO country. But first of all, I just want to ask, do you think that he's serious about that?
I think the Russians are very serious, and Vladimir Putin is not used to bluff. He's not a man who bluff. He doesn't practice strategic ambiguity. That's a Western concept. This is not a Russian concept. So the Russians have always been extremely clear about what they will do in case of this or that. And they have always fulfilled their promises, in fact. So we should be very careful about this. Now, when we talk about this F-16, we know that the problem of the F-16 is probably a place where they can take off and land, because that's the main issue. And we may remind people that in the last couple of weeks, the Russians have practiced or made special efforts to destroy almost all existing landing places and airfield and things like this. Probably not all of them, but they damaged them seriously, and that this could prevent, or let's say hamper quite significantly, the use of this airfield by F-16. The problem is that F-16 is more fragile than the Soviet aircraft, who can take off from any kind of airfield somehow. But the F-16 requires an extremely a tidy place to land and to take off, so otherwise it may be difficult. So therefore there was this idea that this F-16 could be stored in Eastern Europe and then moved to Ukraine, just in order to receive their armament, to be fitted for the combat, and then they would take off for combat, and then they would come back, unload the weapons and change that, and go back to be in the storage area, if you want, in Eastern Europe. So that's the scenario. I'm not sure this scenario is still an actual one, because there were several people who said this is not a good idea, because then the Russians would certainly consider that these primary airfield, if you want, in Eastern Europe could be targeted because basically they are the initial base for these F-16. So here,
I want to bring up something here because that's an important point to make that you're on right now. Now, I want to reinforce why that's such a problem, especially because of the way some Western leaders are saying are talking about this. Because obviously they condemn Russia, saying, you know, if you do that, you expand the war. If you hit these airfields from which these planes take off, then you are expanding the war. But here's a problem with that. Here back from, I believe it's in May 19th of this year, then Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland kind of set the stage for that. Watch this.
I think if the attacks are coming directly from over the line in Russia, that those bases ought to be fair game, whether they are where missiles are being launched from or where they are where troops are being supplied from. I think it's time for that because Russia has obviously escalated this war, attacking Russia's second city, Kharkiv, which is not on the front lines, and trying to decimate it without ever having to put a boot on the ground. So I think it is time to give the Ukrainians more help hitting these bases inside Russia.
So I just say ouch when I see that, because she is emphatically setting the standard, and we have now taken action on it, that we can fire into Russia, or Ukraine can fire into Russia with our weapons, because that's fair game, to use her phrase. And now then, what is the chance that Putin's going to say, it's fair game for me to do the same on these other air bases that are directly engaging in the conflict zone?
It's the typical double standard with this conflict. I mean, when China provide spares or microchips to Russia, we say that China is sponsoring and feeding the war. But when it's the West providing ammunition and logistical support and weapons and tanks and all that, this is not feeding the war. So, and we know since June 2022, I mean, Zelensky himself said that from that point, he depended on Western help, meaning that without the Western help, this war would be finished. By the way, it would be finished even, especially because the West prevented the signature of an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. So, meaning that everything we do is good and everything the other does is bad. Basically, that's so. And with this rhetoric, I think the Russians now have understood that whatever they do, it will always be misinterpreted, and therefore they have to be very clear, and they will continue. I mean, finally, what we are pressing the Russians to do is to destroy definitely Ukraine, because when we say that there is, it has been said during the summit, by the way, that the road towards membership for Ukraine is given, and there will be no alternative than NATO membership for Ukraine, then what is left for Russia? I mean, the alternative is, okay, you want it that way, no problem, we'll destroy Ukraine, so Ukraine will not be part of NATO. So basically, because what we give no chance to Ukraine and to Russia to find an alternative settlement of the crisis. So the only solution remains a total destruction of Ukraine. And I think the Russians have understood that. They also understood that the price to pay for that will be a high price. But at the same time, they understand, and because of these attacks that have been occurred on the Russian territory, they feel threatened as a nation. So they consider that this war has an existential dimension. As a result, they may not have the opposition within the country to go further in this conflict. And probably the Russian will face less opposition within the country than the European countries will. And when you mention,
let me kind of highlight that point here, because something else that was said yesterday by Victoria Nuland again, and you talk about the double standard, but I think this feeds exactly into that mentality of how it impacts the Russian people's willingness to continue to pay a price for this war. First of all, I'm going to show you what now private citizen Victoria Nuland said yesterday, as juxtaposed with something she said in 2014. Watch this one first.
NATO does not attack countries. It will defend its territory. It will defend its partners and allies, but it does not come for you unless you come for us. And it is Putin who has made NATO stronger, bigger, more forward deployed because he's posed a threat to us.
Okay, so remember that phrase, we don't come for you unless you come for us. But here's what happened in 2014. Well, kind of reverses that situation.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming here. This was Nuland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied.
And I'm sorry, I did a terrible job setting that second video up. Victoria Nuland there, when she was a member of the diplomatic staff in Kiev in that time, had been caught on audio with the ambassador trying to say, hey, here's who we think should be in charge in Ukraine, overturning a legally conducted election that because we didn't like that they were leaning towards Russia. So we directly intervened in what was going on in there. And so if we're using that same standard she used yesterday, we don't come for you unless you come for us. We kind of already have done that.
We just to be careful about the words. She speaks about NATO, but she acted as the US. So, and that's why we have to be very careful about NATO is a defensive alliance. Okay, I'm ready to accept that. The problem is that NATO countries do not act in a defensive manner. And you have these guys putting gasoline on the fire. I mean, the US, namely in 2014, and others. I mean, the UK as well, and you had also. I remember in 2014, I used to send a video to the director of the OSCE at the time because we had those Blackwater or Academy type of mercenaries that were involved in the unrests in Kiev in 2014. So meaning that the West was actively participating to the destabilization of the country, but it was not NATO per se. So when what she says about NATO might be correct, the problem is that NATO countries do not behave properly. And that's exactly the problem we have today, because I think NATO has understood, and that's the reason for those bilateral treaties with Ukraine, because NATO has, and probably yes, certain, and probably the US as well, because ultimately NATO is the armored wing of the US to some extent. It's the international armored wing of the US, and the problem for the US is that it through NATO it could be dragged into a nuclear war. And for that reason, they had to make very clear that no, NATO is not involved in Ukraine. I mean, it is indirectly. I mean, we have seen, for instance, the Ramstein group, who is used to be in, I mean, the US was in charge of coordinating this Ramstein group for coordinating the supply of weapons, ammunition, and all that to Ukraine. Now, this Ramstein group will be under the supervision of NATO. So NATO will be involved, but it's an indirect way to say. But directly, NATO is not involved. However, if you have France, for instance, it's a NATO country. And if France sends a brigade to Ukraine, as Macron used to say, then of course you have a NATO country involved, and that's why the NATO very early said, if you go, that's your problem, but NATO is not because then through the Article 5 you may then enter into something bigger that may eventually lead to some nuclear exchange or whatever. So that's apparently the US, even if it let's say it presses Ukraine to escalate the war, it wants to have a kind of controlled escalation. It must not go too far, because that would involve NATO, and NATO doesn't want to be involved in this conflict.
Now I want to show you a clip, Gary. I'm going to throw this a little bit out of order here from what we had talked about earlier, but it fits perfect here. This is what General Wes Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander NATO, said just a couple of days ago about what we ought to be doing along those lines.
All the air defense these countries have that are not on the front line should be pushed forward to Ukraine. Second thing is, you have to create ambiguity in Putin's mind as to what comes next. You can't simply say, here's what we won't do this, we won't do that. You've got to start talking like French President Macron has talked about, creating ambiguity. Send those French aircraft in, put some French troops on the ground in Odessa, put engineers in there to help rebuild the energy infrastructure. Get engaged. Show Putin we mean it.
Show Putin we mean. That's not just rhetoric. I mean, he's actually advocating French troops in Odessa, engineers to try to help do some other things. Tell Putin we mean it. What message does Putin get if we listen to General Wes Clark?
I think, remember when Emmanuel Macron in February said that he would send troops to Ukraine, that prompted a very strong reaction from many NATO countries, including NATO itself. And they said, no, there's no way we want to have an involvement. And you certainly have Polish troops or Polish, let's say, volunteers, even if they are organized in units, but let's say probably not regular Polish army, but you have Polish soldiers fighting in Ukraine. You may have other soldiers. You have, for instance, the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion. They have no official presence in Ukraine, but in fact, what happened is that you had a lot of Ukrainian soldiers in the Foreign Legion, and these soldiers were put on leave, if you want, on paid leave, in order to be allowed to go to Ukraine. But so they go on their own. They are not on a mission in Ukraine. It's on their own. They are still paid, but they are on leave. So this is kind of a hybrid type of situation. So meaning that you may have some kind of involvement from several countries. But the problem is that, as General Wesley Clark says, that it is what he describes, in fact, is kind of an institutional presence in Ukraine that, in fact, is the first step for an involvement of NATO. And I think at this stage, neither NATO nor the US wants to have a formal commitment in Ukraine. I mean, they may have some consultants, they may have those guys who operate missiles and experts, advisors, or a couple of special forces and guys like this, but they don't want a full-fledged involvement in this conflict because they know what this could mean. And I think what Wesley Clark is saying, it's a total misunderstanding of the way the Russians understand that. Because after, I come back to what happened after the declaration of Macron. In fact, the reaction of the NATO and many, including the US, by the way, to send no troops in Ukraine. In fact, this is exactly the opposite of the strategic ambiguity. And what Macron triggered is, in fact, a very clear, a total unambiguity of the strategic posture, because then it was clear that NATO doesn't want to do that. And the problem is that Russia is ready for that option, because they know that even if early this year NATO and the US didn't want to commit troops, it may eventually do that. And the rationale for the Russians to understand that is that everything that happened. The delivery of ATACMS, the delivery even of HIMARS, by the way, the delivery of M1 Abrams, the delivery of smart weapons, all these deliveries of weapons, in fact, were used to be Western red lines. So the West
Mm,
trespassed their own red lines. It was never Russian red lines. It was always a Western red
that's an
line.
important, interesting concept. Yeah.
That's a very important point. And remember all the discussions in Germany to send Leopard 2, and initially they said no. I mean, the even to send HIMARS and these the MLRS vehicles and so on. Germany said no at the very beginning, but eventually they came to the point where they accepted, meaning that all the red lines that have been trespassed in Ukraine were Western trespass. I think the only red line that the Russians have expressed officially was, in fact, attacks in the depth of Russian territory. That's the only red line. And even this red line, the West has trespassed it,
Yeah.
meaning that the Russians are ready for such a situation, and they are. I'm sure they have. If you look at the Russian military thinking, they never give the whole. They don't deliver everything they can at the very beginning. They keep everything, some reserve. They keep some capacities back, in order that, in if you intensify the conflict, they are ready to
Yeah.
escalate the conflict. So they have kind of a escalation reserve, if you want.
Right. Yeah, I get that. I want to turn back to the F-16 issue for a minute, because I think that there's a risk for the alliance that is not well understood at all on our side. In that opening shot I had there of Putin talking from 2023, where he was saying, yeah, you send F-16s, they'll burn just like everything else did. All those M1s, the Abrams, the Challengers, the Leopards that you just mentioned, all those things burn just like the Russian T-72s or the T-80s or whatever else that the Ukraine side had. Certainly the same that the Russians have. Well, anything on the battlefield is burned. So it hasn't made any difference at all tactically in there, but it has diminished the alleged superiority of the Western side because it didn't perform any better than the old Soviet stuff did, frankly. Now, the F-16s is kind of like the crown jewel, because that's what we've waited the longest to give, and now here it's coming in. But as we've seen, and many people have been talking about this, that the F-16 is not a silver bullet in the Ukraine war. It's not going to make some magic difference. But I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about your opinion of what it would mean if those F-16s start flying here within possibly even a few weeks, and they also don't have a difference, and they also get shot down, and they don't have a decisive impact on the battlefield. What is that going to do to our reputation?
First of all, we have to remember that those F-16 are probably not the last generation ones. As I have heard, I'm not an expert in air war, but as far as I know, the F-16 that has been sent to Ukraine are not the latest ones. I mean, the one that were promised by Belgium or Netherlands, they were those F-16 that are supposed to be replaced by the F-35. In other words, these are old generation F-16, and they're probably not up to the mark to fight against the Russian fighters, and they are probably not even able to counter or to be able to evade the S-500, F-400 that the Russians may field in this area. Meaning that, and I'm not even talking about electronic warfare, because what we have seen in the last couple of years is that every single new piece of equipment that was supposed to be the miracle weapon, the Wunderwaffe, as the German would say, so the wonder weapon or whatever. So all these weapons, within weeks, the Russians were able to counter them on just by electronic warfare. Remember, the HIMARS, as it entered, I mean, at the beginning of the involvement of the HIMARS,
Yeah.
their success rate was something like 55%. And now, within months, it has fallen down to 6%. And
6.
now, yeah, it's a massive reduction of effectiveness, and that the same applies to the Excalibur, the
artillery
155
shell, yeah.
millimeter smart shells. I mean, they are not effective anymore. They cost something like $100,000 each, and now the US is not supplying them anymore to Ukraine because they have absolutely no effectiveness. I think there is only 1 out of 19 who reach the objective
Wow.
as a smart weapon. So meaning that within weeks after entering the battlefield, within weeks, the Russians were able to find a countermeasures against those weapons. So
And there's another issue here that goes along with that, with the weapons that the F-16s themselves launch with I think it's the AIM-120 missiles. They're also pretty expensive. Check this out.
There's also the cost factor to consider. Every AMRAAM fired costs $1.8 million per missile to produce. Western leaders have publicly commented and recommended to support those costs for Ukraine as long as it takes to force Russia back. But the Russian strategy of prolonging the war, despite their lack of progress, seems to be banking on this idea of Western support drying up.
And look, you have a similar situation with those interceptor missiles that they have on board as you do with the ATACMS missiles. There aren't that many of them, and our production is very low. So it doesn't matter if you get 800 F-16s or even some, relatively large number that they could have. I think I've heard somewhere between 8 and 12 is all that will be entering the war this year, which is a drop in the bucket. But even if they got that 80 to 85 that I heard Zelenskyy asking for, it's a matter of, do they have the missiles to go on them and the pilots to fly them? And I'm not sure that they do.
You're absolutely right. I think the problem is that, we have to remember that the wars the West has waged since the last 30 years were wars against enemies that were under-equipped, had not access to high-tech weaponry, who were not active in kind of electronic warfare activities and countermeasures and all that. As a result, from those conflicts, our experience is estimation of our capabilities and underestimation of the capabilities of others. And remember, when the Russians started their special military operations, February 2022, everybody was almost saying that Russia had only old technology from the Cold War and things like that. And we didn't take into account the fact that the Russians have an extremely high level of education, both in the armed forces as in the military industrial complex. And they were able to analyze the equipment that we provided to Ukraine thoroughly, and they could develop countermeasures extremely rapidly. And that's exactly the same that will happen with the F-16. So as a result, the myth of the Western supremacy in terms of firepower, technological advance, and all that, everything is already plummeting, by the way, and now you see that countries such as Saudi Arabia and so on, they turn over to China for new equipment. And I bet that this conflict will be the best advertising for Russian equipment. I bet on that.
The Wall Street Journal actually had a piece out. I don't know. It may have even been today. I don't remember the day they had on it, but it kind of supports exactly what you're saying right there, that the high-tech American weapons work against Russia until they don't. And it says Moscow is learning how to defeat Western precision munitions. And it goes on there to talk about all kinds of different categories of weapons, all kinds of things in there. That's showing, I think, a HIMARS on that right there to your point that you made earlier. But if you now add the F-16 into this, and nobody's going to say in the West or anywhere else for that matter are going to say, oh, well, that was the older version of the F-16. The newer versions, they're different. All they're going to see is an American fighter jet that we say is this Wunderwaffe, as you pointed out, and then it doesn't make any difference either. And so at some point you start to say, wait a minute, maybe NATO isn't that great because their stuff is getting burned up just like the old Soviet stuff. And I think that has a cumulative negative impact on the alliance.
Absolutely, totally agree with you. And look at, for instance, just the F-35, which is already, I mean, of course, it's already in service, but it has so many flaws. And there are many discussions in Europe about the rationale for choosing the F-35. I mean, Switzerland is one example. So meaning that in the top tier level of the equipment that the West has, there are always a lot of questions. Now, if you go just under this top tier, you have all this equipment, which is high tech, but probably not the top notch. But anyway, these equipment are exactly those who are involved in Ukraine, and which are discredited by the capabilities of the Russians. So we are in this, absolutely in this case where the deterrent value of NATO, in my view, is diminishing with that, because who would trust an army that is not able to counter its peers? Because that's the issue. I mean, if you fight with a peer army like the Russians, then we can see the flaws of our military systems, both organizational, logistics, and also even the concept of weaponry. For instance, we see the M777, for instance, which is an excellent weapon basically, but it was a weapon that was designed specifically for overseas type of operations where you don't want to have a huge amount of ammunition, so therefore you need to have an impact for each round you fire, and therefore you need to have some kind of sniping artillery. And if you look, for instance, in Afghanistan, US used to fire something like 300 rounds per week, or probably per day. I don't remember exactly the figure, but it was minimal. And the tube of the gun is made for that, so it doesn't support heavy rate of fire, because it's like a sniper rifle. It shoots just a couple of rounds, but it is extremely precisely machined, and therefore it has to be kept that way. If you start to fire a high rate of fire with a sniper rifle or M777, then it loses accuracy. And in fact, this is exactly what happened in Ukraine, that the M777, after a few weeks of use, lost almost all its accuracy, and it has, I think, in the at the target level, it had something like more than 77 meter of CEP, if you want. So instead of having just a few 7 meter CEP, it has 10 times the CEP it used to have. So because of the because the gun is not made for such high rate of fire, so meaning that we have weapons that were designed for a specific purpose, for a specific type of conflict, and that are used in a context which is totally different. And that's exactly what the French, for instance, the AMX-10, typically the MX-10 RC, which is those reconnaissance vehicles that were provided by France to Ukraine. They were designed as reconnaissance vehicles. They have a 105 millimeter gun, which is not bad, or was not bad during the Cold War. The problem is that this vehicle was designed for operating in Africa, where you have a very dry ground and very solid ground. where they were involved in the mud or committed in the mud of Ukraine, these AMX-10 just they were, I mean, the crew just flew as the vehicle was immobilized. The crew flew away because they knew that
Yeah.
the vehicle would be destroyed.
Right.
So we see that we have an equipment that was designed for a totally different type of war than the one we are supporting in Ukraine. By the way, the same applies.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, the same applies to the training of the individuals. And even I remember that was reported by the Washington Post, if I'm not wrong, that even Ukrainian soldiers complained
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
their
it was.
instructors back in the UK or in France or in Germany had absolutely no idea of the kind of war which is waged in Ukraine. So meaning that our armies are tailored for a totally different type of conflict. Our Air
And
Force, our air defense,
yeah.
everything is tailored for this a different type of conflict.
And let me just add here in the last little bit of time we have a challenge that I think is also under the radar of most Westerners, because we just think that you can't rise to the top of our military or our political unless you are really good and you've got a lot of thoughts behind it. So I had a meeting in Washington, D.C. just yesterday, and I talked to a certain fellow that I can't describe except to say that he's very well placed in the U.S. Department of Defense. And we were talking about some of these things and some of the just crazy talk, in my view, that came out of whether it's NATO or the U.S. military or some in the administration. And he said, listen, there's something you got to understand, because this guy works with a lot of high-ranking people. He said, there are the skill set that you need to function properly at this level is to a good sort of like engineering kind of mentality, like you understand system of systems and you understand how cascading effects work, and how if you're talking about doing action A, that there is consequences C, D, E, and F, et cetera, and you should think in those terms. He says, but our political and military elite that he saw, he says that they basically think in terms of counting, like they can, like financial, what the financial issue is of a given act, and PR, public relations. They know how to manipulate the media, et cetera, but they cannot think beyond stage one. It's almost like checkers and chess kind of a situation. We're playing checkers. Now, the consequence that have is when you say things and you mean them, but it's like when people who like you, who do have that kind of mentality, listen, you think, I cannot believe I just heard that come out of his mouth. Victoria Nuland comes to mind. But also, here's a retired 3-star general, Ben Hodges. This is, I think, no, this is today. This was earlier today at the NATO summit here in Washington, D.C. Let him speak for himself. Watch this.
There's nothing they can do. They do not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. Now, they're going to continue losing 1,000 soldiers a day because they don't care about their own casualties. But I don't think that this is endless. I mean, even their manpower is not endless, and certainly their industry. Even if we don't get serious about sanctions and about cutting off their ability to ship oil, I don't know that they can go another 2 years.
Okay, let's put that in context. Just imagine this. This is a man who was a 3-star general, commander of all U.S. forces in Europe, or all army forces in Europe. And he's saying that I don't think that Russia has the industrial capacity to go another 2 years. And I don't know that they have the manpower to go in another 2 years. Oblivious to the fact that Russia has millions more, up to 15 million more in some studies I've seen recently, military age males than the Ukraine side does. And their industrial capacity is off the charts and growing in comparison to anything that the Ukraine and its allies can bring to the table. But you see, he said that with a straight face. He really thinks, yeah, keep fighting because Russia is going to lose, within 2 years, and Ukraine somehow is not going to collapse, and they're going to continue to be able to throw men into the meat grinder. It just boggles my mind.
Oh, in fact, Ben Hodges is probably the typical example for this kind of thinking. But Sun Tzu, more than 2,500 years ago, used to say that the worst mistake you can do at war is to underestimate your enemy. And that's exactly what we are doing. I mean, when we talk about the casualties and the losses of the Russian army, is just listening to what the Ukrainian propaganda is saying. We know that is not true. And we know that the figures provided by the Ukrainian government are not right, and that the Russians lose much less troops than said in our media. And recently, Vladimir Putin said that the ratio of casualties between Ukraine and Russia is 7-1. And there are several calculations that some experts have done, and I have done that myself also based on the estimate provided by Mediazona, which is an opposition organization that works with the British BBC in order to make some estimate of the Russian losses based on obituaries and everything that has been published on the social networks. And when we compare those figures, which have, I mean, the methodology was pretty good. I mean, it was so good that, in fact, Mediazona just changed and replaced this methodology, which is extremely reliable, by the use of an algorithm that multiply by a factor of 3 or 4 the number of casualties. But okay, that's another discussion. In any case, if we compare the figures, we can estimate as let's say, reliable regarding the casualties. We can confirm this idea of 1-7 in favor of the Russians, meaning
It
that
makes sense. How can it be? This is what always puzzles me, that people give this consideration. We are led to believe that the reverse is the case. It's 1-6. 1 Ukrainian casualties for every 6 Russian casualties, even though those same people say that the Ukraine side is outgunned 10-1 or 5-1 in some areas. And somehow you're supposed to believe that the side that's outgunned and out ammoed 10-1 is inflicting 6-1 casualties in the other direction. It just defies any kind of common sense.
but we have to remember that if we analyze the war, and as you rightly said before, our leadership, both military and political, tends to have a kind of a tactical approach to war. They tend to see the tactical aspect. They are basically corporals with stars on their shoulders.
Oh,
That's what
wow.
I usually
That's really
say.
well said.
That's that's exactly what I mean. But beyond that, if we analyze the conflict, we can see that the Western approach to this conflict is in fact narrative based or narrative driven. Everything is based on a narrative. Everything we see on the battlefield shows and demonstrates that Ukraine is a bad position, is a worsening position. We see that every day, and you in your various programs and interviews, you have demonstrated that hundreds of times in your own show. But uh, so we know that. But again, we try to convince the average citizen, the average politician, the average taxpayer that it's still worth continuing this war, although nobody has been able to define what could be a victory. Remember when Lord Austin was asked by the Committee on Armed Services of the Senate Armed Service Committee, and he was asked whether what could be victory for Ukraine. He was not able to articulate what it could be, because nobody has an idea of what that could be. Nobody, and that was, I think it was the New York Times that yesterday or 2 days ago was saying that there is no way Ukraine can recover the territory it has lost, and even a portion of it. So we know that the situation on the ground is absolutely hopeless. But again, we rely on the narrative rather than on the observation on the battlefield. And that's the tragic part of the situation, because the Russians are much more rational and they have an approach to war which is much more holistic than the West. because the West has lost this ability in the wars it waged. Because when you have to wage a war against an enemy which is significantly weaker than you don't have to to ask you a lot of questions. You just fire, you destroy, and that's it, period. But the problem starts to arise when your enemy is at roughly at your level, probably a little bit above or a little bit under, whatever. But then you have to start about the strategy. We have fought wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere in the world without any strategy, just tactics. But
Yeah.
today, if you look at the way the Russians waged their war, they waged their war with a strategy. They have strategy, they have operational art, they have tactics, and all that is very well organized, structured, and commanded. And you find that in the command structure, you find that in the approach, you find that in the way, for instance, that it's also significant to see the fact that the Russians paid equally importance to the development of the society in Russia as to the war in Ukraine, because they understand that without the popular support of the Russian population, they could not wage this war. As a
Yeah.
result, they developed also the civilian economy. They developed, and that's why they developed also the relationship with China and all that, to have all the supply on the civilian market for EVs, for every kind of equipment and all that, so that the population feels much better. And they are very successful, since recently the World Bank just upgraded the Russia to the level of high level income society, because so far it was the middle upper level income
Yeah.
society. Now
So
it's
yeah,
so sorry.
I know we keep things just keep going in the worse and worse direction. I'd like to ask you one last question here before we shut down, because while most of NATO has been talking about just the narrative, as you just put it, and just pretending like things aren't the way they are, like Hodges and others are like that. General Wes Clark, another American general, was making those similar kinds of comments earlier. But one man, Viktor Orban, seems to be focused in a different direction, and he's been on this peace dividend. We've had some shows on it. We're going to be talking about it later this afternoon with John Mearsheimer a little bit more. But he said something, Viktor Orban did, in some of his interviews that we talked about yesterday, which I think kind of got my attention. And I wonder if you can tell me what you think that he means, because especially through the first 7 months of this year, the fighting has been horrific and bloody. You just alluded to some of the casualties on the Ukraine side. But he said he wants to go towards peace now because over the next several months, he said, after visiting with both Zelenskyy and Putin in person, he said the fighting is about to intensify and it can get even worse. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
Oh, first of all, we have to remember that Viktor Orban, as opposed to other leaders in Europe, he has a direct interest in this conflict, because you have a significant minority, I mean, Hungarian minority in the western part of Ukraine, which is affected since 2014, by the way, by the rule, this ultra-nationalistic rule that prevents the use of national languages and things like that. Even the schooling system has been affected by the ultranationalists. They prevented the use of Hungarian language and all that. So, and that's the reason for which, since the very beginning of the conflict, Viktor Orban said, I'm not taking part to this conflict, because Viktor Orban several times complained to the European Union and the Council of Europe against Ukraine and the mistreatment of its minority. And the problem is that now its minority, the Hungarian minority, gets more and more recruited in the conflict. I mean, one of the reason why Viktor Orban went to see Zelensky was precisely to discuss the fate of its own this Hungarian minority. This is a very important thing, and for Viktor Orban, this is, I would say, the driving element in his policy towards Ukraine, because I'm not sure he's more concerned about Ukraine as a country as others, but he's very concerned about the Hungarian minority. And that explains probably that. On the other hand, I think Orban has understood exactly what I said before earlier in this show, that the choice that is given to Russia by prolonging the war is very simple. I mean, since there will be no negotiations, and since apparently, despite the fact that Zelensky has expressed the interest of having negotiation, including the Russians, by the way, because he said recently that for the next summit on peace, Russia needs to be involved. So, meaning that Zelensky understands that if he wants a solution, this has to go with the Russian. But the West doesn't want that. As a result, there is only option for Russia. It's to destroy Ukraine. That's exactly the point. And I think Orban has exactly understood this option, but there is no alternative. If you look at the options to solve the conflict, if you make the assessment that there will be no discussion because the West will prevent at any cost any discussion with Russia, that means that the war has to go to continue.
There's no alternative left for Russia but just to capitulate, which they would never do, especially from a position of strength. Well, listen, Colonel, we really appreciate you coming on today and sharing this stuff with us like always. We just really treasure and value your input there, because you don't put it on from a nationalistic perspective. You put it on for, this is what the facts on the ground say, and here's a good assessment and analysis, which is sorely lacking in the Western world today. And we very much appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. That's always a pleasure to come on your show. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we appreciate you guys as well. We're going to be back on this afternoon at 2 o'clock, Washington, D.C. time with Professor John Mearsheimer, where he's going to be talking about NATO declares Ukraine membership irreversible. Is it really? And is that in our interest as well? And I also want to remind you that we have a Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army a membership that we have. So we always appreciate you guys coming on and making all these comments that we have here. And I can hardly get to very many of them during the show, but one of the great things about being a member is when we have these Deep Dive Army huddles, which we're going to have tomorrow. This is the next one, so you still have time to join up for that one. Because we can do things like, we can kick around ideas about different things that we want to do, some things about politics, the American election coming up, the impact that could have. You can ask me anything that you want. We can chat each other up. We get to know each other better. And if you join and become a member of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army, you too can be a part of this, which will be tomorrow. And so we're going to ask you to join and tune in with us then. And we will look forward to seeing you this afternoon with John Mearsheimer. And tomorrow, where we can engage back directly. Thanks. We'll see you on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.